Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today with lots and lots of news. Our lead story is the aftermath of the tragic shooting in Georgia. The father, Colin Gray, of 14-year-old shooter Colt Gray, was arrested and charged with manslaughter and more. Hunter Biden pleads guilty to tax evasion and could face up to 17 years behind bars. And Donald Trump will find out whether New York Judge Juan Merchan will met out his sentencing for the felonies or punt until after the election. Telegram founder and CEO Pavel Durov speaks out for the first time since his arrest last week in France. We begin, though, in Georgia. Weiner, Georgia is still reeling from Tuesday's shooting at Apalachee High School that killed 4 people and injured 9 others. Colin Gray, the father of 14-year-old gunman Colt Gray, was arrested Thursday and charged with 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 2 counts of second-degree murder, and 8 counts of cruelty to children. According to the affidavit, the arrest warrant alleges he gave his son a firearm knowing he was a threat to himself and others. Per CNN, the father told Barrow County Sheriff that he gifted his son the AR-style gun in December of 2023. That was the same firearm used in the Apalachee shooting. That father was arraigned Friday morning. This case is now the second in U.S. history in which a parent has been charged for their child going on a shooting spree. In April of this year, the Crumbleys were sentenced to 10 years in prison for their son's 2021 mass shooting at a Michigan high school.
Now, more information is trickling out about this suspected shooter, including that the FBI had linked a Discord account to Cole in which he shared plans for a future mass shooting. He also posted screenshots of firearms, according to documents that CNN obtained. The Discord account also referenced Adam Lanza, the Sandy Hook shooter, and captioned the photos of firearms, quote, "I'm ready." So this family was under a bit of investigation. There was in advance officers that had gone to their residence specifically about these concerns that, he had aspirations to become a mass shooter, was very interested in all of this. And so for the father to gift a gun to his son that was, investigated for this, there wasn't enough evidence that he was going to do anything. So law enforcement didn't feel they could take action at the time. But what kind of father would arm a child that was investigated for this? So I believe in red flag laws. I think they're one of the few things that don't jeopardize Second Amendment rights and actually could have an impact. I think they would have prevented something like this from happening here, Amber, although I would like to believe a parent would.
Yeah, I guess the question is, would you red flag the dad because the kid was only 13 years old, so he's not even of legal age, obviously, to purchase his own firearm. He would have had to get it from a parent, and this is negligent at best, but the decision-making from the father is completely out of bounds, and the FBI failed miserably here, too, of course, by interviewing this kid back in 2023, just a year ago, and not taking greater steps to prevent him from committing an act like this. They basically took the dad at his word that he had guns locked up, that the kid wasn't going to be able to access them, and then a few months later apparently gives him one for Christmas. Unfortunately, we see too often with these mass shootings that there were often warning signs, and in some cases the FBI knew in advance, just like in Parkland when the shooter there was called in multiple times by friends and family members who were worried that he was going to do something, and the FBI failed to even investigate those tips. I guess we could say that at least the FBI decided to follow up in this case, but there has to be something beyond just talking to the kid, getting him in some kind of mental health treatment. If he's in a bad home environment, getting him out of that home environment. According to a really bizarre Facebook post from the shooter's aunt, he had a lot of struggles at home. It suggested to me that there was some kind of abuse going on, and that is unfortunately often the case with these school shooters, is that they have a very difficult home life, a very tragic home life, and they commit these horrible acts for some kind of deranged form of attention.
Right. Yeah. It feels like almost emoting, expressing an anger at society, at their community for, I don't know, failing them, which certainly happened here. For the father to arm this child This wasn't, a good dad, I will say. If you know your kid very well and you hear something like this about them, I mean, wouldn't you take every possible action so they don't go down that path? I mean, even not just to be a good parent, but to be a good neighbor or a good community member or a good person. And so it definitely seems like something has gone wrong here. So many times when you hear about mass shootings, your brain goes to we, as adults have failed children. People have a right to peacefully go to school in a modern country. That's like a no-brainer. The fact that we can't keep kids safe in public school in their K through 12 education is really sad. And it's a damning thing on communities. I don't really point to, the lack of restrictions on guns as the main reason for this, because time and again we find out that people in the community, that law enforcement, that family members, that classmates are aware that someone is a threat. And time and again, that person who is a known threat ends up being the suspected shooter in one of these mass shootings. And so it's really sad. And it feels like we as a society have failed time and again in so many different ways. And I can't imagine these kids that grow up going to school afraid that it could happen to them are going to have a lot of faith in government or in larger society in the United States. And that's going to be a whole additional crisis we have to deal with when these kids become of voting age, when these kids become decision makers in our society. That's really concerning as well. And I don't fault them for it because it's true that we failed them.
Right. I mean, it's an important point about gun control measures because obviously in this case, again, this kid was 14 years old when he committed the shooting, 13 when he first started making threats. I would just challenge anyone who's pushing for some kind of law in reaction to this, which one would stop a 14-year-old from getting a gun that doesn't already exist. There is a federal law that requires you to be 18 to purchase a rifle. You have to be 21 to purchase a handgun. Those age restrictions are already in place. Basically, the only thing that you would be able to do is ban guns entirely and stop people from having them in the house, which is a violation of the Second Amendment. There's been reporting that school shootings, at least the casualties from school shootings, have increased since the pandemic. And I don't find that all that surprising. As we're talking about the reasons why people commit these acts, we often find that these are people who were isolated, who were lonely, who had tough home lives. And unfortunately, during the pandemic, a lot of schools were shut down. That safe haven for kids in a lot of cases was gone. They were stuck at home with perhaps an abusive home life, abusive parents or siblings, and they didn't have a way of socializing with their friends. And people who were already kind of struggling with socialization only had that issue compacted and compounded even more aggressively. A lot of kids, even if they're not committing school shootings, are struggling immensely with learning loss and a lack of development of social skills since the pandemic. And I don't think we can allow our public health bureaucrats and our governments, our state governments especially, who made these policies, to forget that they implemented something that was incredibly harmful for young people. And I think we'll continue to see the impact of that for generations to come.
Right. These kids are traumatized for the rest of their lives. The interviews with the children are heartbreaking because we have so many mass shootings happen in the United States that when this took place and the high school's name was trending, the Apalachee High School in Georgia, people said, I just saw high school trending on Twitter and I knew it was a mass shooting. And it can be tempting to tune out because we hear so much about these mass shootings. But honestly, I think it's good that they play the interviews with the kids on cable news so everyone can see because they're like, I pray actually every day that it doesn't happen here. It's not like I didn't think it could happen here. It's I am worried it would happen here. And that's sad that that's reality for these kids. One of them said the officers were telling us, not to look around. And I know it's, protocol not to look around, but I couldn't help but look around. And I looked over and saw a kid dead. Imagine going back to school and trying to learn in a place where that's happened. That's sad. And that's going to be horrible for these kids' education. Education outcomes, I'm sure, are affected by the reality that they have to have these lockdown drills. I remember having them. We didn't call them, shooter drills, school shooter drills. We just called them lockdowns. But now it's very well known what these are about. I mean, when I was in middle school and elementary school, they kind of shielded us from that. They were like, oh, it's just in case we all need to lock down. There's storms, there's this and that. Now kids are fully aware of this very violent reality. and live a part of their lives in fear. What's that going to do to their nervous system as they age? There are so many implications to this, and we've really got to find a way as a society to come together and give someone the support they need if they're suspicious a family member could turn into this, or a classmate or what have you. Because it usually you hear something horrible about a family member, and it can be devastating to hear a family member would do that. But you deal with it. You say, okay, this person maybe is a little bit of a monster, and you get resources and you get them help. And so, this idea that that hasn't happened, I think, is an indictment of maybe people not being good community members and supporting people who have a son or a family member going through this, or a classmate.
Yeah, and as important as it is to take this problem seriously and address it head on, I also think helping tamp down the fears by being responsible about coverage is important too. There is a lot of, I think, analysis from the media that suggests these are far more common than they are. When we look at the Washington Post school shooting tracker, for example, they include a lot of things that we would not typically consider to be a mass school shooting. So, for example, if someone brings a gun into the parking lot and leaves it in their car and somebody finds it, that's considered a school shooting. Or if there's an accidental discharge from a security officer or something to that effect. There have been cases where there have been domestic disputes on off-campus college apartments that have been considered school shootings. So when we actually look at the statistics of it, these are still incredibly rare. And so I don't want us to also be, putting fear into kids that shouldn't be constantly scared that going to school could be a death sentence. That's still not the reality in America, thank God. One final point I wanted to make on this, and then I'll throw it to you for the close, Jessica, is that there was this really nasty article from the Associated Press, and this is something that happens all too often, unfortunately, in the aftermath of events like this, is that it becomes very partisan and very nasty. The Associated Press ran an article with the headline that J.D. Vance says school shootings are a fact of life and calls for better security. And Zaid Jilani actually pointed this out. He is obviously by no means a conservative. The actual full quote that J.D. Vance said was, "I don't like that this is a fact of life," meaning I disapprove of how common they are, saying, "But if you are a psycho and want to make headlines, you realize that our schools are soft targets and we have got to bolster security at our schools." So for them to take that quote out of context like that for the sake of scoring cheap political points after 4 people just died is a major indictment of our media landscape right now. And again, I think my overall point with all this is we all need to be more careful in how we talk about these things too, because the immediate panic is the type of thing that inspires copycats. Because again, this is an attention thing, and fear mongering about it and being too breathless about it doesn't really help either.
Yeah, I will say the technical statistic for a mass shooting is 4 people shot or more. So I haven't seen, the statistics of mass shootings misrepresented,
Yeah,
because that's a pretty
I should
clear and
say
cut.
school shootings. I should say school shootings as opposed to mass shootings. They have the Washington Post has a school shooting tracker that includes some of those other instances I mentioned. But thank you for catching that.
Yeah, I think we've seen 50 people killed in school shootings in 2024 alone. That's just too many lives lost, too many kids going to school to get an education that, end up killed at the end of the day. And I think Congress, we have so much talk about, gun control, so much talk about, mental health being the main concern. It's one thing to say be good community members, but this is something that Congress can put resources to, because a lot of people, especially in the working class, cannot afford health care, let alone mental health care, which usually isn't included in typical health care coverage. If we are to allow people to be good community members, we've got to ensure that people have access to health care and mental health care, and put their money where their mouth is. If you think it's a mental health problem and you're a member of Congress, if you want to do something about gun violence, vote for the dollars to be allocated and the tax dollars that are collected, a part of the public money, to go back to the communities of the people who work so hard to generate revenue and generate profit in our society. This is something that people need. Congress needs to put their money where their mouth is and actually allocate the dollars necessary to address the issue in a meaningful way. I think we're at the point where you can say it's a mental health issue till you're blue in the face, but at the end of the day, you don't really care about it unless you're willing to do something about it. And so I'm just really sick of mouth service from Congress when they're in a position to act and we're allocating billions and billions of dollars every year to the Department of Defense to overpay to weapons to send to a genocidal regime that is responsible for killing children. It just feels like we've got all of our values and morals backwards, especially among our elected officials in Congress who have done nothing on this issue in a meaningful way.
All right, we're going to leave it there. We'll be back with more Rising after this. We are 60 days out from the presidential election, and popular pollster Nate Silver has shared his latest prediction. Silver, the founder of 538, who now runs the Silver Bulletin, believes Trump is electorally favored to win the election. He wrote, quote, "The forecast is still in toss-up range, but Trump's chances of winning are his highest since July 30th. Silver has Trump's chances of winning the Electoral College at 58%, with Harris at 41%. He cited several reasons for the growing gap. He wrote on X, quote, "In addition to Pennsylvania, Michigan has become something of an issue for Harris. National polls and polls of other swing states mostly decent for Harris, but erosion in Pennsylvania and Michigan hurts a lot in the model." Silver doubled down on Harris's state polling problem and said, quote, "Setting the convention-bound stuff aside, there just hasn't been much positive state polling data entering the system for Harris lately." Silver added that he would, quote, "buy the bull case for Harris a bit more if she hadn't rehired so many of the Biden people." He also blamed Harris's chances on a lack of Democratic enthusiasm. A new YouGov poll shows Republicans have taken back a narrow lead of voter enthusiasm at 60% compared to Democrats' 59%. Silver wrote, quote, "There was a surge of enthusiasm for Harris post-Biden dropout, but that might have happened no matter what. Thought the convention speech was good, but bypassing Shapiro beginning to look bad, and they haven't really found a second gear after hot brat summer." The pollster also said the chance of an electoral college popular vote split working against Harris has risen to almost 18%. So, Jessica, I know you're a big vibes gal. Is Nate Silver right? Has hot brat summer worn off?
I think hot brat summer just turned to fall. That's all that happened. Charlie XCX posted that brat summer is over. Kamala Harris is still getting like a lot of attention on the internet from young people, but I think among, progressive members of the left, people who are definitely, making a decision based on her stance on Gaza, those voters that were hopeful, I don't think are as hopeful as they used to be, that Kamala Harris can win them over before, election day, November there. I do see the data that Nate Silver puts out. And I will say this is the same model that did predict Hillary Clinton in 2016. He made some adjustments to that model because of COVID. He believed that there were certain weights that needed to be added, certain factors considered for COVID. And he said it was essentially the same model, aside for those adjustment factors. Then with this model we have now in 2024, it's essentially the same model. He says he just took away the COVID factors. So we're still rocking with the same old model we had in 2016 favoring Hillary. So I would just take anything Nate Silver says with a grain of salt. The model essentially is a compilation of polling plus some other factors that they made up. I think someone, throwing spaghetti on the wall and seeing what sticks and tallying the numbers and saying, the spaghetti on this wall is Trump, the spaghetti on that wall is Harris, has just as good a chance of predicting right now with what we're seeing, Amber.
Yeah, I will say he changed the model a little bit more than he previously did between 2016 and 2020. When he left 538, although he retained the IP for the model, he did make more adjustments before launching the Silver Bulletin. But just looking at the polls that have come out this past week, it does suggest that things are not looking super great for Kamala Harris. If you look at the Real Clear Politics average, for example, Trump is actually performing the best he has of any election cycle between 2016, 2020, and 2024. In Michigan, a very well-respected local poll has the race there effectively tied. You have pretty much every national poll within the margin of error. The only one that has Harris in the lead in the swing states is the Morning Consult poll that came out this week. And I'm sorry, but if anyone thinks that Kamala Harris is up 8 points in Wisconsin, then I have a bridge to sell you. But for the most part, it's very clear that this race is incredibly tight. I don't think you can give the edge to either candidate at this point, except for the fact that a tie is usually good for Republicans just due to over-surveying of Democrats and the fact that Republicans don't typically feel as comfortable answering polls.
Yeah, I will say it's Nate Silver's exact words that the model in 2020 just added in some COVID factors, and that the model now took away the COVID predictor factors. So if he's made other changes, he should include those in his model descriptions. But I think, what's going on this time around is you've got Donald Trump, who had thought he would end up running against Biden. Now he's had to pivot his campaign to run against Harris. And it seems like he wasn't ready for it. He spoke before the New York Economic Club and was asked a bunch of questions about, what the fiscal deficit we can predict with his changes to tariffs and tax policies. He didn't have any estimate. He talked about Biden's deficit being 2 trillion when he added 7 trillion to the public debt. And so this idea that Donald Trump is better on the economy when he can't even hold a conversation with these guys, I think was not so good. The way he's wavered on issues like abortion, the way he's gone back and said in response to all of the IVF criticism that somehow he's for free public health care when it comes to IVF. I think he's scrambling a little bit. And if that's any indicator of how the next few weeks will go, I don't think that bodes well for Trump. I think the Democrats would be smart to just ensure that those clips of him in these meetings doing this press, that those clips get posted on the internet. They don't really have to do a ton of anti-Trump messaging, because I think that benefits him. He runs on the establishment hates me. I think they just need to make sure people listen to him when he's talking and listen to him contradict himself.
Well, he hasn't wavered on abortion. He's actually been really consistent on it since he first ran for the presidency in 2016. He has said that he is someone who considers himself pro-life but supports reasonable restrictions and exceptions for rape and incest. Now he has said that he supports the states deciding, which, that doesn't mean his personal position has changed on it. And he even said before the overturning of Roe v. Wade that he hopes the issue goes back to the states. So I think the idea that he's wavered on abortion or flip-flopped on it is sort of a creation from the left. And then on the economics question, I would just say that I highly doubt that Kamala Harris would be able to talk about how much her plan is going to increase the deficit, considering she hasn't even posted a plan on her website yet. She hasn't talked in any policy detail on any of her speeches for the past month and a half, 2 months, about what exactly it is she's going to do. She's stolen 2 of her proposals from Trump, including no taxes on tips and increasing the child tax credit to $6,000. And then she has this harebrained price control scheme on groceries, which is going to lead to a scarcity problem for families. I think, when it comes to the economy, even if you have issue with the way that Trump explained it, it's just a fact that the economy was better under Trump than it is now.
Yeah, I think, it matters to people what Trump says he's voting in Florida. Last week, he said he planned to vote no on a ballot measure to enshrine abortion rights in the Florida Constitution. He publicly said that he supported the 6-week ban. Then he said he was voting against it.
He didn't say he supported the 6-week ban.
Then we had 10 years ago, he said that, he was pro-life. And then when he ran in 2016, he catered to evangelicals. He said, we've got to ensure that pro-life justices are appointed to the court and Roe is overturned. And so, yeah, he caused a panic by implying to a lot of people that his personal no vote meant if he was president, he might overturn Florida's 6-week ban. Then he said he would not do that. And so, yeah, I think the last 2 weeks have been a lot of flip-flopping. At least that's what the media is reporting when you put these statements next to each other. I don't know if his internal beliefs on abortion are the same, but publicly, certainly it seems like they've been going back and forth a bit.
Well, he never said that he was supportive of Florida's 6-week ban. He was against it from the time that it was moving through the state legislature. And then his vote against the amendment is because the amendment would basically prevent any restrictions on abortion. So his personal feeling is that he would like to see a 15-week restriction. But he said repeatedly he also thinks that 6 weeks is too early. So that's what he's been saying for the past year or so. I don't know where the media reports are coming from that he's flip-flopped. I would suggest that those are inaccurate. We're going to continue to cover this, of course, here on Rising. We'll be back with more after this. YouTube has taken down Tenet Media Channel and several other channels operated by Tenet's owner following Attorney General Merrick Garland's indictment. The Justice Department alleges Russia funded a Tennessee-based media company, largely believed to be Tenet Media, with the goal of amplifying political divisions in the United States. Business records show conservative media influencer Lauren Chen and her husband, Liam Donovan, are the owners of Tenet Media, per the Post. Prosecutors allege Chen and Donovan knew their funding was coming from Moscow and acknowledged it in messages to each other. Chen's contract with Blaze TV has since been terminated. Independent journalist Ken Klippenstein reacted to the Justice Department's efforts, writing, quote, "Russia and Iran and China and others, even Israel, are surely trying to influence American public opinion. That's what nation states do. And the effort since 2016 has now become bread and butter talking points for the threat machine. But are any of these foreign actors a threat to the elections? The answer is no." He joins us now to discuss it all. Ken, thank you so much for joining us today on Rising. And I want to ask you about this piece. It's in your Substack, and it's titled "Russian Influence Operations Are a Joke." And you talk a little bit about the reach that this Tenet Media organization had and how it's pretty minuscule when you compare it to the larger media environment. So I'd love for you to just go through some of the reasons why you were skeptical that this deserved the sort of breathless coverage that it received.
Yeah, so they had basically a press conference led by the Attorney General, the FBI director, and several other leading members of the national security community, where they kind of discussed this and a couple of the other indictments in terms that I thought were really hyperbolic. If you look at what the National Security Director, Assistant Director of the FBI, said in an announcement accompanying the indictments, he described it as psychological warfare being propagated against the American people, and they have all this language about it's undercutting our democratic fabric. Now, I personally don't have any problem with them prosecuting violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, but to act like this is going to have any sort of appreciable effect on the body politic in the United States, I think not only do I think that's ridiculous, folks in government think that as well, including elements within the security community that have been specifically tasked with investigating, working on foreign influence efforts. As I quote in the story, the lead CIA author of the Intelligence Committee assessment into Russian interference in the 2016 election himself says that this whole thing is very unlikely to have any sort of lasting or appreciable effect, much less swinging the election, which is often the subtext of discussions like these, which can have an ironic effect because the more people hear that, the more likely they are to doubt the election. And so it can end up having a sort of paradoxical effect than what the government expects it to have. So I really hope that there can be a more sober discourse around what exactly happened.
So Tim Pool was getting like $400,000 a month from these folks. This is a guy with 1.4 million followers. That's not exactly market rate for someone of his reach. What do you make of that hefty pay?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, going back to what I said before, I don't have any problem with them prosecuting the case. I think when you look at the indictment, I found it compelling. They had a lot of details. And as you suggest, there's not the level of demand commensurate with what you would expect pay like that to be. Towards the beginning of the segment, you mentioned, my own traffic. When I saw the numbers in the press release and in the kind of breathless reporting about it, oh my God, they got, 7 million views in total on YouTube. I thought to myself, okay, that sounds impressive, but just on Twitter where they're constantly blaring the view count for every post, I've seen numbers like that for individual posts. So I went to go look at my own and I realized I have generated more views than the YouTube videos that they reference in the indictment. And I'm just a guy. I mean, I spend time on Twitter and I have some kind of a following, but it's not like I'm Taylor Swift by any means. So I wish that context was included in the discussion of it. And as you say, there's plenty of reason to think that the Justice Department's indictment, as alleged, is more or less the case. Because why are they paying these influencers so much money for stuff that is not that popular? But that's kind of my point. Is it might be a legitimate case in a legal sense, but I wish that press and the government would provide that context so that people don't overreact to the significance.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that Russia is not very good at these influence operations if they're paying that much money for such little engagement. And we saw something similar in the 2016 election where there was all of this talk about Russian influence on Facebook, and you looked at the engagements and it was, a few 10,000 or 30,000, nothing that I think anyone should be that worried about. But another angle I wanted to cover on this is the fact that there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not this op was specifically intended to help Donald Trump. And I think it's worth pointing out that Lauren Chen has been one of the pro-life activists who has been encouraging people not to vote for Trump recently, and that a few of the people who were on Tenet Media were DeSantis supporters during the primary. And when we go back to previous Russian ops, we see that the goal was less about partisanship and more about general chaos, where we had simultaneously accounts boosting Trump in 2016 while also boosting Black Lives Matter rallies and Bernie Sanders. So can you just talk a little bit about what the Russian goal might be and how to sort of divorce that from our framing that everything is left versus right?
Yeah, you're exactly right. If you read carefully the statements that the Director of National Intelligence and the intelligence community more broadly has made, their primary focus is sowing dissension, discord, discontent. And to the extent that they're interested in elections, it's often there's less evidence for that there's a preference for a candidate, which is what people like to obsess about for partisan reasons, than that they want to undermine Americans' faith in those elections more generally. And so when you have the tenor of the conversation, say in 2016 about what was happening then, clearly the Russians were behind the hack and leak operation. And so it makes sense that people would want to talk about that. But then to take that step and say, okay, all of this made the election unfair for Hillary Clinton is a completely different assertion, and one which, again, undermines people's faith in what I think is legitimate electoral system. And so, the Director of National Intelligence put out an intelligence assessment, I think about a year ago, talking about the 2022 midterm elections. So what was interesting about it, this wasn't Russia, this was Iran. They said that Iran's interest was not so much in swaying the election as in getting Americans to think that the election results weren't reliable. And so those are two distinct goals, and one which, if people have better appreciation of, I think that there'd be a more sober tone in which these kinds of issues are discussed, so it doesn't lead to that kind of panic and hysteria that can get people to question election results, which they shouldn't.
Yeah, I think something this is definitely has exposed is that there's certainly more money on the right to push a narrative that's pro-corporate, maybe pro-authoritarian. The far right has been known to be friendly to America's biggest corporations. People like Dave Rubin, who's implicated in this, have gone from being a progressive on the Young Turks to starting his own The Rubin Report, where it's more conservative. It's no secret that members of the media on the right are raking it in a little bit more than on the left. What do you make of that trend and how this has, been a huge piece of evidence in exposing that?
Well, it is extraordinary because I remember watching these videos and thinking, who is their fan base? Like, I do have conservative friends, and I don't hear them saying like, yeah, I'm really excited to see the next Dave Rubin clip or whatever, So I always, it's funny. It's like kind of some kind of an affirmation that it's like, yeah, there was something like astroturfed about this entire thing. But if it's not the Russians, maybe it's some conservative billionaire like David Koch or the Koch brothers or whatever. And so, I think that all goes to people's distrust of media more generally, and whether what they're seeing is real or if it's something that someone else wants them to say. And so I think that's part of the reason that a story like this has taken off to the extent it has, because people do have this sense, not just about conservatives, but in general about the media they're consuming. It's like, okay, is this like organic or authentic, or is this something that some rich guy wants me to see? And so to the extent that this story has gone really viral, I think that's part of it. And so it makes sense that people will be interested in it. I just hope that we're able to approach it with some degree of caution and cool-headedness.
Yeah, I definitely don't think that's an exclusive trend to the right and media. I mean, Jeff Bezos does own the Washington Post. So,
right.
I mean, billionaire investment, foreign investment, unfortunately, is not uncommon in American media on both sides of the aisle. But I wanted to get into the foreign policy aspect of this, because I wonder, my anti-establishment sense is tingling. I'm thinking, why? Okay, maybe the blob, so to speak, is blowing this up so much because it's sort of a convenient way to tamp down narratives about the Ukraine war, perhaps not being an area where the United States wants to send hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. Maybe they want to tamp down people who are skeptical of American involvement in that conflict more generally. And this is sort of a convenient way, because these people appear to be compromised, to dispel all narratives surrounding the Ukraine-Russia war.
Yeah, so historically, foreign adversaries have tried to exploit or put some resources towards magnifying narratives which they consider beneficial, but which were in themselves legitimate. So, for example, during the civil rights movement, there's abundant at this point historical evidence for that the Russians tried to some degree, I think mostly ineffectively, to amplify the legitimate complaints of Black Americans who wanted, better and more equal treatment under the law. And so when you look at a case like this, one of the most unfortunate reactions, and I saw this on Twitter, is people saying, "Oh, therefore the discourse around Ukraine, that all must be paid." And again, that's a leap, because some of it can be paid, some of these influencers can be paid, and there can be people that have organic concerns about these things that by definition are going to be taken advantage of by foreign governments. Anytime, if your goal is to spread dissension and chaos and to exploit divisions within society, you're going to pick real divisions. You can't just make one up. The most effective ones are going to be real ones. And so that's another issue on which you got to look at it and be careful in how you proceed with this, and be clear about what this indictment means and what it doesn't mean. And it doesn't mean that the concerns that perhaps this media company was being paid to exploit were created out of whole cloth.
All right, Ken, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
President Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, could face up to 17 years of jail time as he pleaded guilty on Thursday to all 9 charges in his federal tax case. He could face up to 17 years in prison for charges of tax evasion, filing fraudulent tax returns, and failing to pay taxes. The judge said he could also fine Hunter Biden $1.3 million. District Judge in Los Angeles, Mark Scarsi, who was a Trump appointee, set a sentencing date for December 16th.
The possibility of a presidential pardon looms overhead, but Joe Biden has ruled this out. And White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre told reporters yesterday, it's no, it's still no, when they questioned whether the plea deal had affected President Biden's decision about whether he would consider pardoning his son. So I don't know why they keep asking him this. He's been pretty consistent from the start. Maybe they thought that because now he's not the Democratic candidate that he would change his mind. But I think we're not going to see a pardon for his son. It's interesting to see the media landscape now around Hunter Biden and around Tim Pool and Dave Rubin and Benny Johnson. Very different treatment of people accused of being foreign agents for different reasons. But I just don't see Biden coming around on this. Amber, do you think he's going to change his mind?
I don't rule anything out with this election cycle, but I appreciate that Karine Jean-Pierre has actually given a consistent, clear answer as opposed to sort of equivocating and waffling as she's often known to do. The interesting part of this case for me, though, is the timing of this guilty plea, because this case has been bouncing around for a number of months now. You would have thought that if Hunter Biden was interested in pleading guilty, that he would have been negotiating this with the prosecutors well before they actually appeared in court. But it looks like this deal was basically hammered out on the steps of the courthouse between Abby Lowell and the prosecutors. And I was watching some legal analysis on this over the weekend, and the suggestion was that if you wait until late in the game to plead guilty, not only does it make your sentencing date pushed until after the election, but it also negates the ability for you to have to cooperate in some manner with the prosecution, namely to give other people up. So it's possible that this is a form of protection for other people who might have been involved in some of Hunter Biden's foreign business ventures.
Yeah, I think that someone like Hunter Biden taking this plea deal at this point in time, there's probably some negotiation as to what would be included. We know that his team has been very skilled in negotiating deals before, deals that even judges question.
The best
And so I think
deals.
that, yes, yeah. It was the best trade deal in the history of deals in the federal court. But I think that, yeah, he's not going to get away with, an agreement for immunity on any other crimes with this one, that's for sure. But I do think that, it could have been the negotiation process, because I really don't see this impacting the election any more than it already has, right? Biden's not the nominee. A lot of the bad press swirling around about this and the evidence against Hunter Biden has come out already. So I don't think him taking a plea deal now versus later, sentencing before or after the election, is going to influence Kamala Harris and Tim Walz's vote share. Especially when you have Donald Trump facing so many criminal charges himself, and he is the candidate. I think people have sort of divorced Hunter Biden from the Democratic ticket in their mind if they're on the left, and this was something that they cared about. I think there are a lot of people who care about corruption and would like to see further action taken, but we're not seeing that from either side. So I don't think it's going to influence the election very much. But I do think personally, Biden dealing with this in his last days in office has probably, I don't know, soured his lame duck, if you can call it that, when you step aside as the nominee, the presumptive nominee, his lame duck days as president. It's kind of sad that he has to deal with this, but he's such a family man. He's my son and I love him. Not enough to pardon him. I think he sees that as, furthering the corruption narrative.
Electorally, I think you're right. This won't have much impact. I think it would be much more damaging for the Biden-Harris administration if he did take this to trial. So just from a political strategy standpoint, it was the right move for Hunter Biden to plead guilty. He released a statement after the plea, and he said, quote, "I went to trial in Delaware, not realizing the anguish it would cause my family, and I will not put them through it again." Of course, that was in reference to the case with the gun charges, where he had purchased a gun while actively addicted to drugs. He continued saying, "When it became clear to me that the same prosecutors were focused not on justice, but on dehumanizing me for my actions during my addiction, there was only one path left for me. I will not subject my family to more pain, more invasions of privacy, and needless embarrassment." And time again, when I hear these statements from Hunter Biden, it seems like he wants to be absolved for anything that he did while he was addicted. And that's not how you're supposed to take accountability for your actions or responsibility for yourself when you get clean. The idea that you wave a magic wand and because you're sober now, everything you did while addicted doesn't matter is a fallacy. And so these statements, he put out a similar one ahead of the gun charge trial, and I think it rubs a lot of people the wrong way that he thinks that he can just accuse people of belittling his addiction. When, yes, obviously people make choices when they're addicted that they might not otherwise. But again, that doesn't erase the slate for you. You still have to make amends, take accountability for the things that you did while you were struggling.
Right. When you're at the consulate of Italy asking for some kind of deal to be made for Burisma, the Ukrainian energy company, you're invoking your father's name to get some influence. You can't have it both ways. You can't be associated with Joe Biden to get a better business deal, but want to be exempt from the press and media attention you get from being Joe Biden's son and using his name to get business deals done. If he lived a very private life and never did any of that, if he was even a businessman that kept to himself and didn't deal with, foreign companies, maybe they were based in the United States, that would, made his life a little bit easier. But I think if he lived that kind of lifestyle, of course it would be wrong for the media to be scrutinizing his actions. But I think this is more so about the misconduct as it relates to corruption and using an American vice president's name to get deals done. And so, yeah, you just can't have it both ways. I totally understand someone's right to privacy, and that addiction is hard and it's painful for the family. But unfortunately, this is a life that the family has chosen for themselves. and he tried to use it for his own personal advantages. And that's just something that I think you open the door yourself for that. And to play victim once you're already in the room is just not a good next move. It's not a good way to garner sympathy from the press or get them to stop their attack line.
Right. Well, and that's exactly right. The problem with Hunter Biden's business dealings was because he was using the fact that his father was vice president to peddle influence abroad. Even worse than Ukraine was the fact that he was on the board of this Chinese energy company, CEFC. I mean, that's an active, adversary of the United States. And the IRS whistleblowers who came forward during this investigation who said they were hamstrung from looking into potential connections to other members of the Biden family, namely Joe Biden himself, is very concerning. I hope at the very least that House Republicans continue their investigation into this, because I don't feel we've really even scratched the surface of what Hunter Biden exactly was up to and who all knew what and when. But I'll probably keep wishing, because as we know, Congress is not very great at doing their job. We're going to have to leave it there. We'll be back with more Rising after this. Telegram CEO Pavel Durov broke his silence after being arrested in France at the end of August. For background, French authorities took Pavel into custody August 28th on charges related to illegal activities on the app. Per authorities, the crimes on Telegram include the spread of child sexual abuse material, fraud, and drug sales. Pavel posted publicly Thursday on his Telegram account criticizing the French charges as misguided and denying the app as an anarchic paradise. Durov went further, writing, quote, "If a country is unhappy with an internet service, the established practice is to start a legal action against the service itself. No innovator will ever build new tools if they know they can be personally held responsible for potential abuse of those tools."
Now, French citizen detailed what ensued following his arrest. Per his post, Durov says French police interviewed him 4 days after landing in France and told him he could be personally responsible for other people's illegal use of Telegram. He pushed back on French authorities' claim that Telegram was not responsive to their inquiries, posting, quote, "Telegram has an official representative in the EU that accepts and replies to EU requests. The French authorities had numerous ways to reach me to request assistance." So I would say, how convenient would it be if there was one place where all of the pedophiles and sex traffickers were, and then you could just work directly with law enforcement to ensure these guys are found? I mean, this idea that he wasn't cooperative, I think, is going to be what needs to be proven for people to not see this as some kind of effort to end Telegram, which is an app used frequently by activists. Let's not forget that very recently, the French far right tried to take control in their elections. They hated that there were protests over people who were upset about the consideration that they would increase the retirement age. French has a very active base of protesters. And so this idea that they're outlawing this app because it's used for criminal activity feels like it's really about something else. So they're going to need to prove that this EU representative was not responsive to their investigations and their requests.
Yeah, I agree. And if we look at a similar situation in the United States, there have been lawsuits filed against porn websites, specifically Pornhub, for allegedly profiting off of child sex abuse material and otherwise non-consensual sex that gets posted onto their websites. Now, their websites have upload features where people can put up videos without prior approval from the website. And so it's up to the website to be proactive in helping to go through that content and make sure that it's fit to be on the internet. But you don't see the owner of Pornhub being arrested and frog marched into a jail cell, right? You see that there's civil lawsuits against the websites themselves in federal court over these claims. And so his comparison there, saying the typical response to complaints about a service is to go after the service, not the founder or the entrepreneur, I think is an apt one based on what we've seen happening in the United States. Obviously, different countries, different rules, but I think to hold him personally liable or responsible for what's going on in the app when there's certainly millions of communications that happen on there every single day just doesn't strike me as the right way to achieve justice here.
Yeah, as the whistleblowers with Cambridge Analytica put it, that the use of data, the use of technology is like a knife. You can use it to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. You can use it to kill somebody, and it's all about how you use it. And so, is the CEO responsible for the personal decisions of people on the app? I mean, if we want to compare it to something else, it's like if you leave a gun at your house that's registered to your name and you live with other people and they're allowed to use it and they use it to kill someone, is that your fault? I don't know. I don't think so. And so when you develop an app, are you developing it for the purpose of people to use it for nefarious things? And it's important to note that this is an encrypted communications app. It's a place for people to send messages without someone spying on them. The idea that the government would target this kind of app has a lot of people raising questions, not just about free speech, but about their personal safety. In the United States, if this were to happen here under our laws, it would certainly be a Fourth Amendment concern for an unreasonable search and seizure that the government would expect, the app to just turn over all of the encrypted communications, because you have to have some kind of evidence collected to prove you have probable cause, that you have a reason to believe some suspicious behavior is going on. And that requires law enforcement to do a little bit more work than maybe they're willing to. But at the end of the day, I think it's far less about them trying to find criminals and far more about the fact that they see this kind of encrypted messaging service as a threat to power, especially government and corporate power. And that's why it's become a target. And so they really are in the spotlight. This is not something that they've been able to get done under the radar. And so I don't think we're going to end up seeing the CEO, Pavel Durov, in jail. I think the solution should be, something that could have come out of a civil case, like a renegotiation about how the authorities work with the executives and representatives at Telegram. If this is a problem, why didn't they ask him to appoint more representatives to the EU to address the increased traffic or the increased amount of requests to process? It just feels like there were other more common sense ways to resolve this that would have resulted in maybe more of these human traffickers and pedophiles getting caught. And it feels like they intentionally didn't take that route in France.
Yeah, and my understanding is that Telegram is encrypted, the chats are private, but they have always had a policy that they would remove illegal content. And I guess I'm not super clear on what requests exactly they would field from the federal government where they would, or the French government or whatever government, where they would actually turn over the communications. The language suggests that they don't do that they don't cooperate, but then they also say that they take illegal content very seriously. So I would want to know more about exactly what that relationship was like prior to passing judgment on Telegram or the French government. But generally speaking, I mean, your analogy about the gun in the apartment was an interesting one. I mean, I saw something similar on X where someone was describing this as someone, the French government forcing you to put recording devices in every apartment that you own. If, let's say, you're a landlord, you have to put recording devices in every apartment. And then at the end of the week, you have to give the recording device over to the French government so that they can listen to everything that was said and make sure that there was nothing illegal that people were talking about. I mean, fundamentally, this is a speech issue. And I would always err on the side of allowing people the right to speak.
Yeah, I think if we were in a place where the police were regularly solving the criminal cases that they do have and they could handle more information on crimes, I would be like, you know what? You guys have done such a good job solving all of the violent crimes we have. Here you go. Here's some more information. No, they don't even investigate the crimes that they have ample evidence for. They don't even test the rape kits that many of them have a backlog of, and people are getting pulled over for traffic violations. I think this is the exact kind of thing that sows a mistrust in government here and anywhere. You have the government meant to enforce laws, but instead using their power for something nefarious to consolidate their own. I think that's the main problem I have with this, is that in the United States, at least, we've seen a lack of action for a lot of violent crimes, and we've seen the Justice Department weaponized. Why? Why are we pushing criminal charges against Hamas leaders? Is Merrick Garland going to ensure the DOJ arrests them? Why are our resources not being used to keep people safer? Why are they instead being used to make international political statements? So I think this very thing is exactly what sows mistrust. And I think the French authorities have a lot to answer for with this case, but I think we're going to continue to follow it because it's incredibly interesting. We could even, Amber, take that knife analogy. If I gave my friend a knife set and they used it to murder someone, am I an accomplice? But I think your landlord analogy is probably better because it does have to do with eavesdropping. What did they expect? What requests did they have that were not being fulfilled? I think that's what I'm really fascinated to see come out of this criminal proceeding.
Yeah, I mean, bare minimum, we should hope that whatever outcome they reach is one that protects the speech of everybody around the world. Although in Europe, there's been some crazy stuff happening with speech, with governments going after people for social media posts that are perhaps politically opposed to the current government. So I'm not super optimistic, but we're going to continue to follow the case here on Rising.
Yikes. Donald Trump struggled to talk himself out of a rather simple question about his policy on childcare while at the New York Economic Club. Let's watch that.
If you win in November, can you commit to prioritizing legislation to make childcare affordable? And if so, what specific piece of legislation will you advance?
Well, I would do that, and we're sitting down. I was we had Senator Marco Rubio, and my daughter Ivanka was so impactful on that issue. It's a very important issue. But I think when you talk about the kind of numbers that I'm talking about, that because look, childcare is childcare. There's something, you have to have it. In this country, you have to have it. But when you talk about those numbers compared to the kind of numbers that I'm talking about by taxing foreign nations at levels that they're not used to, but they'll get used to it very quickly. And it's not going to stop them from doing business with us, but they'll have a very substantial tax when they send product into our country. Those numbers are so much bigger than any numbers that we're talking about, including childcare, that it's going to take care. We're going to have, I look forward to having no deficits within a fairly short period of time.
Jessica Tarlov challenged her co-hosts on Fox's The Five to make sense of what he said. Let's watch.
I would dare any of you to listen to his answer on childcare and tell me what the hell he was talking about. It was one of the more incoherent things I've ever heard. He thinks tariffs are going to pay for everything. We know that they're a tax on the consumer. But this really highlights a big problem that everyone is saying, well, Trump is so transparent and Trump's out there and that's all that matters. What matters is the content of what he's saying. And none of it is explainable. This issue, which is a big priority for people, obviously a central plank of what's going on in the Harris campaign, he doesn't have an answer besides tariffs. And J.D. Vance yesterday was talking about just have grandma and grandpa do more, that's some sort of solution for people. He's going to have energy prices, drill baby drill, even though we're producing more oil than we ever have before, leading the world, more tax cuts for the rich, and tariffs are the only way that we're going to be paying for it.
I think what's fascinating is he didn't give an answer in his response to the question. But why didn't he just say nothing? He felt like he had to give some answer, like, yes, we are going to do something. I will prioritize some kind of legislation to make childcare more affordable. It sounds like the solution being grandpa and grandpa take control, tariffs, which is, goods, not services, where we can't import some kind of, childcare robot. Is that how that's going to reduce costs? There's really no explanation there, but it's interesting. He didn't feel comfortable just saying, we're not going to do anything on it.
He's talking about the fact that tariffs would increase American wages, presumably through the reshoring of manufacturing, and also reduce the federal deficit, which leads to higher GDP growth. And having an overall healthier economy can give more families options when it comes to childcare, whether they have higher take-home pay because they're paying less in taxes or they're earning higher wages, means that they can better afford childcare. Or even better, for a lot of families who want one of the parents to stay home with their kids, if they have a higher earning breadwinner in their family, then you don't have to have a two-income household anymore. And you can have mom or dad stay home with the kids and not give 75% of their paycheck to childcare. And I know that's what he was talking about because J.D. Vance dropped a 350-word policy proposal on X just yesterday in response to a user, where he talked about the fact that just paying for people's childcare doesn't really solve the fundamental problem, which is that too many people are caught in this two-income trap where they're not able to stay home and take care of their kids. When most women surveyed who have kids say that they wish they could stay home, but they just can't financially afford to do it. And grandma and grandma are being referenced as people who could potentially help take care of kids because even if you cover childcare, what you end up creating is a scarcity problem. Unless you have more supply of childcare providers, simply just having the government pay for it means that the prices are actually going to increase even more because you're going to have a higher demand. He talks about this as well. If you subsidize something but don't increase the supply of it, you're going to raise prices without getting an increase in quality. So I would recommend everybody go read this tweet from JD Vance. Again, he posted it yesterday at 10:30 a.m. It's a nice 350-word little policy proposal and really talks about the fundamental issues facing American families that have created this childcare crisis.
Yeah, I think that with the tariff thing, if I'm someone who's working minimum wage in the United States, let's say I have a manufacturing job, I am not optimistic that charging a higher tariffs on foreign goods coming in is going to bring manufacturing home because you just raise prices. If tariffs are 10%, raise your price to be 10% higher, have the consumer pay it. That's what we've seen the effects of tariffs be over the years, and they'll keep saving the costs of keeping manufacturing offshore. So unless Trump has some kind of plan to incentivize the manufacturing to come back or force these companies to come back or set price controls so that that cost is not pushed onto the consumer, I don't really see that working. But I do think for anyone who finds his perspective on the economy, whatever it may be, that is it concerning that you gave a better description as to the cause and effect there in the policy plan than the candidate did before the Economic Club of New York? Like, are you worried about that, Amber, his inability to describe it as you did? You did a better job than he or JD Vance did.
I suppose you could say the same thing about Kamala Harris, who described deadlines related to time in her first big sit-down CNN interview and is sort of known for her word salads. I think it's pretty negligible. It's kind of a wash between these two about who is more coherent. But I will say that even when Trump has some of these word salad moments, they seem to have more substance baked within than when Kamala Harris is talking about yellow school buses. But all of that being said, economists do disagree with your analysis of tariffs and how they're simply a tax on the consumer. Jessica Tarlov said that in that Fox News clip as well. And most economists who have analyzed Trump's plan say that the cost to consumers would actually be between negligible to about $2,600 a year, which would surely be offset by the potential increase in wages. The reason that tariffs would help with bringing manufacturing home is that it makes it more expensive for businesses to do business in China, for example, for them to outsource all of their labor to cheap Chinese workers, because you're making up for that gain in your profit margin by having to pay that tariff when you import the goods back into the United States. According to this article from USA Today, where they interviewed economists, they said some economists even argue that Americans would come out ahead in the long term. Kent Smetters, who's a University of Pennsylvania Wharton School professor, says he's somewhere in the middle. Forecasts in the thousands make rigid assumptions that aren't necessarily true, some economists said. For example, the Peterson Institute for International Economics says that assuming the entire cost of the tariff is passed on to the consumers or domestic producers is not exactly accurate. A study by the Nonpartisan Tax Policy Center also assumes that consumers would pay the entire tariff amount, which most economists agree is an overestimation of the direct impact on consumers. So there's a lot of conflicting analysis of what exactly tariffs would cost to the consumer, but I think bar none, you could say that, of course, they would reduce the federal deficit and would have a generally positive impact on U.S. manufacturing. Trump does have a plan for reshoring manufacturing as well. I would check it out, agenda47.com.
Yeah, I think, Kamala Harris's plan is very clear. We would be hard pressed to find her asked to explain her economic plan and get a response like this. If we did, it would be played over and over again on Fox News. I mean, when she did her campaign trip to North Carolina, And she spoke about increasing the child tax credit. That was pretty coherent. I know exactly what that plan is. If I'm being honest, the chain of cause and effect is depending on a lot of actors that want to maximize their profits to do the right thing by families to reduce their childcare costs when we know that's not how corporations make decisions. They're absolutely going to do everything they can to keep their profits high. And so I do see the doubling the child tax credit as something that can reduce care costs directly to families. And I don't know why Donald Trump, if he's going to give a response to that question, that is as long as it was, why there's no direct link made there, why there is no economic plan there. This is the Economic Club of New York. And so to not be able to speak coherently in front of them is shocking. To not even be able to string a sentence together descriptive of a plan is shocking. And if that was Kamala Harris, it would be played over and over again. There's a reason Fox isn't playing her talking about her economic plan, because they don't want their viewers to see what the other side has to offer. And so this idea that Trump can get before them and not be able to say what the deficit will be, or what the impact on the deficit will be, because of course it's dependent on Congress's budgeting. But he can't even say what his tax changes and tariff changes, what that effect will be on the deficit. But he can say that the $2 trillion under Biden was bad when he's added over $7 trillion. So his lack of understanding of the macro economy and ability to explain the cause and effect of his policies, I think, is a huge liability here. And I'm not sure how I feel about his mental capacity. And I say this as someone who is critical of Biden for this, who is, not a Democrat, who is not a Kamala Harris supporter. But how can he speak this way and people are not questioning his mental fortitude and ability to serve at the highest office? I worry about people getting in there and running the government in a way that's totally different from what the elected leader wanted, just because he seemingly can't describe his own plans. So who wrote them?
Fox News has been covering Kamala's economic plan, namely the price controls that would lead to scarcity in groceries for everyday Americans, and also the unrealized gains tax, which would absolutely cripple entrepreneurship and small businesses in this country. But that being said, they're not covering Kamala's word salads about her economic plan because she hasn't sat down for an unscripted conversation like the one that Trump did at the Economic Club. The speech that you're referencing in North Carolina was read off of a teleprompter. I could read just about anything I didn't know anything about off of a teleprompter and sound coherent too. But until she does the media, gets under the media scrutiny that Trump has, between Trump and JD Vance, they have collectively done almost 40 interviews in the past year, or the past 2 months rather, since Kamala Harris ascended to the top of the ticket. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz have done a collective 4. Kamala herself has done 1, and it was an 18-minute softball interview from CNN. So until she starts doing press conferences, does these sit-down remarks and question and answer sessions at various clubs and places and organizations, then it's not a fair comparison to say, well, she sounded coherent when she was reading off a teleprompter and Trump was sitting down for an unscripted Q&A with the Economic Club. So I don't think those two things are comparable at all. And then I would also say on the child tax credit, Kamala Harris only came up with that plan after it was already proposed by Trump and Vance. They offered to increase the child tax credit to $5,000. And then Kamala responded by saying, well, okay, that's fine, guys, but guess what? I'm going to do $6,000. I mean, it's ridiculous that she thinks that she can just basically one-up the other party platform, and that's going to somehow convince voters that she really knows what she's talking about.
Yeah, I think, JD Vance has been called out about his hypocrisy over the child tax credit time and again. I mean, he would have showed up in the Senate to vote for the proposal to expand the child tax credit and help 16 million low-income kids get ahead if he actually cared about working families, but he didn't even show up to the vote. So this idea that he's
what was the
a
bill?
guy who cares about it was the child tax credit plan from Senator Ron Wyden. He didn't even show up to vote on the bill. And so the bill passed in the House in the February, but it failed to overcome the GOP filibuster in the Senate earlier in the month. JD Vance
what else
been
was
a part
in the bill,
of it during
though?
it passed in the Senate, but he wasn't. So at the end of the day, these are guys that care so much about working families when they're running for the highest office. But as someone who grew up in a working family that struggled to get by during the recession, I have a hard time believing anyone who's going to cut taxes for America's biggest corporations who are keeping prices high and wages low but not cut taxes by the same margin for working people, cut them by a lower margin and have those expire in December of 2025, but have corporate tax cuts be permanent and by a greater margin. I just can't really believe those guys are for working families.
You should look at the bill that they were actually voting on, because it included things besides a child tax credit that ended up being a poison pill for Republicans. And I would also point out to you that Kamala Harris in 2017 voted against a Trump-backed bill to double the child tax credit. So if there's any hypocrisy, it's coming from the Kamala Harris campaign. We're going to continue to talk about both candidates' economic plans here on Rising. We're going to take a quick break and be right back. We may soon see a whole lot more of Elon Musk here in Washington, D.C., as former President Trump outlined a government efficiency commission that Musk has agreed to lead, of course, if Trump is elected. He announced the program at the Economic Club of New York. Let's watch.
At the suggestion of Elon Musk, who has given me his complete and total endorsement. That's nice, 'cause smart guy. He knows what he's doing. He knows what he's doing. It's very, very much appreciated. I will create a government efficiency commission tasked with conducting a complete financial and performance audit of the entire federal government and making recommendations for drastic reforms. We need to do it. Can't go on the way we are now. And Elon, because he's not very busy, has agreed to head that task force. Be interesting. If he has the time, it'll be a good one to do it, but he's agreed to do it. In 2022, fraud and improper payments alone cost taxpayers an estimated hundreds of billions of dollars. As the first order of business, this commission will develop an action plan to totally eliminate fraud and improper payments within 6 months. This will save trillions of dollars, trillions. It's massive. For the same service that you have right now, trillions of dollars is wasted and gone, and nobody knows where it went. Further taming inflation and bringing prices way down.
The commission would take an aggressive swipe at regulations and would pledge to rescind certain unspent funds. The overarching goal would be to identify ways to eliminate fraud and improper payments. In response to the news, Musk tweeted, quote, "I look forward to serving America if the opportunity arises. No pay, no title, no recognition is needed." And in a separate tweet, he wrote, quote, "This would unlock tremendous prosperity for America." So what do you think, Jessica? Elon Musk joining the government, or I guess being some kind of advisor, and a new commission, the Government Efficiency Commission?
Yeah, I think it's a little funny to me that the party that rails against, I guess it's not the whole party, it's mostly Donald Trump, that rails against the bureaucracy is planning on expanding it to rein in the bureaucracy.
Oh,
that's exactly how the bureaucracy grows. We have so many different divisions of government that are tasked with doing this. So I don't know where they think they're going to find the personnel to do it. I don't think Elon Musk particularly has experience with auditing or accounting or finance. That's not exactly his background. So the idea that he's the person tasked with doing this, I just don't think it's a good fit. As Trump points out, he's got a lot of free time. Does he really, as the head of SpaceX and Tesla? I mean, he posts on Twitter a ton, or on X a ton. So it seems like he has a lot of free space. So is he just a figurehead of these companies? He wouldn't want us to believe that. I think Elon Musk is a bit of a phony, but I think something like this is good. Some restructuring of the budgeting process. It's definitely something that's going to have to get passed through Congress. There's no reason it shouldn't originate in Congress, but I do appreciate when someone uses their, I don't know, media presence as the head of state, as the executive commander in chief, to bring attention to something that does need to get passed legislatively, because there is this issue where funds are allocated to different divisions of government and they find some silly use for the funds so that they don't have their budget cut in coming years. Because if they see that there's unused funds, Congress will allocate less in the next year. There needs to be some kind of audit to ensure that the public dollars going to these divisions are not inflationary, are not allocated when they're not putting real productive resources to use. That's good. Do we need Elon Musk and a whole commission and new division of the alphabet soup of bureaucracy to get it done? That's what I maybe disagree with here.
You're right. I mean, it shouldn't be the case that Congress allocates funds and then if they don't need as much as they were given, that you have to spend them. Once they're allocated, they have to be spent. I think that's ridiculous. And, the Pentagon hasn't passed an audit in 20 years, but I disagree with the idea that because they're creating a commission, that means they're expanding the bureaucracy. I mean, Trump has been pretty much the only candidate running for president in the past 8 years that has talked at all about making sure unelected bureaucrats are not doing the bulk of policymaking in the federal government. He has proposed this plan with Schedule F that would have made it easier to get rid of civil servants who are not helping with the administration's agenda, that would rein in some of these unelected bureaucrats doing rulemaking. Recently at the Supreme Court, we had the court overturn Chevron deference, which was a great thing for the American people, as you have so-called experts in government administrations who really don't know anything about the topic that they are creating rules for, doing the job of Congress, which is to write specific and detailed legislation. Instead, Congress has been punting on its responsibility, intentionally making things vague, and then outsourcing the interpretation to the federal rulemakers. And then the courts, for a long time, since Chevron deference was introduced, have basically had the benefit of the doubt that their interpretation of the legislation is correct. So I think all of those things are really great for democracy in general, for returning power to the American people. Even if you don't appreciate the way that Trump wants to do it, I think bare minimum you have to say that he is the only candidate who has actually talked about making sure that people who are coming in with an administration are there to do the work and do the job and getting rid of some of the unnecessary fat. We haven't seen that from pretty much any other campaign that's tried to tackle this in a really serious way.
Yeah, I think it goes without saying that you expect the people in government to be doing their jobs, and if they don't, they should be fired. I don't think a candidate needs to run on the government should function, but Trump could have drained the swamp a little bit when he was in public office. He didn't take much significant action to rein in the bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy are the federal, different parts of the government. You have the Department of Homeland Security, the various government departments that he talks about, the Department of Energy, the Department of Education. He seems to want to end the most popular ones, the Department of Education, the idea that we should somehow defund the federal arm of public education, and that will make education, better in the United States. But not questioning the Fed or the Treasury or how they operate or the inefficiencies there. It just feels like it's lip service to talk about an issue when it would be expanding it to create a new commission at the higher level that could turn into a department. That is more bureaucrats. Those are federal government employees. And just because he would house them within the cabinet doesn't make it any less bureaucratic. Who is he going to hire to do the actual auditing work? Those are going to be bureaucrats. Those are going to be federal employees. That would be an expansion of the bureaucracy. And so I would love to believe that Donald Trump will get in there and make sure it gets done. I don't think that he will. And I don't think that Elon Musk would be the guy to do it. I don't even think they'd know where to start. And if they did, I think he would have started it day one in office in 2016 because his number one promise was to drain the swamp. And we just didn't see that happen.
Well, political appointees by definition are not part of the bureaucracy, but then I would agree with you to some extent that he should have done more on this in his first term. There were plans actually to implement Schedule F during the second term with Johnny McEntee at the head of the PPO, but obviously he didn't win re-election, so that plan was scrapped. But he did expose a lot in terms of the Department of Justice and the FBI and their weaponization of their political investigations, cleaning house of some of the individuals who had lied on FISA warrants to spy on members of his campaign and pushed circular confirmation of things related to Crossfire Hurricane through the media. But of course, I would have liked to see more on that. A lot of the reason for that is because Trump didn't pick good people the first time around, and as much as he said he picks the best people, that wasn't right for his first term in office. He very much relied too much on the Washington establishment and the Republican establishment to staff his administration, and he ended up with a lot of people who were actively working against his agenda, even though they were supposed to be political appointees who were helping to enact that agenda. And that was something that unfortunately hamstrung him throughout basically his entire term. I think he still accomplished a fair amount, but when it comes to taking on government bloat, you absolutely have to have true believers on board with you who are willing to take the hard steps to do that, even if it doesn't seem popular up front. So that's where I would definitely agree with you that I don't think he did enough in his first term to take on the quote unquote swamp.
Yeah, I think everyone who sees the federal government and the bureaucracy running inefficiently and budgeting done by Congress in a way that's a little bit backwards, I think you should pay attention to this next tax fight. We're going to have a total restructuring of the tax code. Pay attention to the next congressional budget fight. I'm going to be doing a ton of coverage on it. I'm sure this show will run coverage on it. But really, the way you put pressure on that is you call your elected officials. They have people writing down what their constituents say and what they call about. And if they get a flood of calls about something, they absolutely fear losing reelection. And they will change their tune. It's happened before in tax fights. It's happened with the good reporting done by The Intercept around the CFPB's creation. And so you might think only electing someone like who's speaking about it to the highest office, to the presidency, is the way to make change. But actually, if you really care about it, call your elected officials during these fights. And when the Congress is doing their budgeting, it will actually make a difference.
That's going to do it for us this week on Rising. Jess, always a pleasure.
Yes, another Rising Fridays wrapped up. We didn't coordinate our outfits today, but we're close.
Yeah, we've got some, cool tone sort of pastel kind of things going on. All right. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Bye, y'all.